What's up, everybody? It is Suzyruin here, and we're going to talk about corruption today. I have a list of advantages and disadvantages, and this is my personal list. If you have some comments that you want to make, go ahead and type them into the comment section below. If I leave anything out that you feel is very important or that I may have overlooked, please let me know, because this is sort of a growing project at the moment. Corruption. What is corruption, and why is that important right now? Well, it's important because it has some certain advantages, and I'm just going to jump right into the first advantage here, and that is that it essentially will allow a player to ignore eye level to a certain extent. So what I mean when I say that is that you may find a piece of gear that has a better corruption than any sort of stat increase that you can gain through eye level. And that's important because where we used to be able to just sort of stack eye level and make that sort of our benchmark as far as like where our damage or healing or even mitigation in some instances is actually measured, those metrics aren't as important anymore, because especially for damage dealing classes, there are some corruptions that are just so powerful that the eye level, it shadows the eye level. So you may find a piece of gear that's a 425 eye level, but it has a very powerful corruption on it, and then you compare that to a piece of 445 eye level gear that has no corruption, and you'll probably take the former versus the latter almost every time. So that is one distinct advantage that corruption brings to the game, and that changes a lot of things. It changes how you play. It changes your output. It changes your rotation sometimes, just depending on sort of what sort of corruption you get. So it's very interesting in that regard. Now, another advantage that it has, and we're going to go through the advantages first, then we'll talk about the disadvantages, because there's numerous of both. So just hang in there with me. But the second advantage is they can be very large increases for very little effort. Corruptions. So if you just get lucky out doing world quests, like I mentioned, and this is sort of relates back to the eye level piece, and you find something that's on an eye level, 425 piece of gear, just by doing like a world quest, and it has the perfect high tier, and we'll cover tiers of corruption here in a little bit, corruption on it for you, that will replace maybe even a raid piece that you're wearing that you've had to actually work for, versus, the one that you just got, the piece that you just got has a better corruption on it, and you're replacing your raid gear with that. So it's very counterintuitive as far as the normal metrics we would follow to increase our bonuses as players, especially, and again, when I'm talking about these corruptions, generally what I'm talking about is from a DPS standpoint. So that's sort of my perspective on it. I'm just letting you know that. But it also does something else, and this is another one that I'll file under advantage. It can be an advantage or disadvantage, however you want to look at it, but it lowers the skill cap of the player. And when I say it lowers the skill cap of the player, I don't mean that it actually makes you worse at playing your class, but it can breed a behavior that would honestly create some laziness, because it would allow that type of play, because it's related to your rotation. And this is another advantage, is that your rotation is actually less dependent on getting it right. If you have the right corruptions, you can basically sort of cheese your way through things and still be top in DPS meters if you have the right corruptions on your gear. So the skill cap is lowered if you want to play that way. That's certainly a choice. And then also your rotation simplified. So those are sort of two distinct advantages that you would have for corruption as well. Now, with all that, you will sometimes, if you're stacking the correct corruptions, you may have, all 425 eye level gear, let's say, but you have stacked, 3 high tier infinite stars, and you look like a god on the DPS meter. So that's another advantage that you would have for corruptions. They can make you look like an absolute god, sometimes as far as the meters are concerned. Basically shadowing everyone else in your raid, especially on certain encounters with certain types of corruption, just depending on what you're stacking. Infinite stars for like a balanced druid or something like that is absolutely incredible, especially if you stack it high enough. Now, the way that they've sort of countered this is they've added an amount of tolerable sort of safe play mechanic, which is usually around the number 40. If you're stacking more than 40 corruption, generally you start to experience the side effects that make it sort of where you want to turn that corruption down. So you can only stack so much, and that's what I refer to as a corruption budget. So let's say I'm in a raid, let's say I'm in a heroic raid, and I know that the mechanics are going to be a little bit more difficult than normal. The healers are going to actually have to heal. I'm actually going to have to put out some damage here just to get through the encounter. The last thing that I want to have to do is to dodge 8 other mechanics, one which could probably kill me because I'm stacking too much corruption during the encounter. So you have to turn that dial down a little bit in order to sort of keep it within a tolerable amount. And 40 is generally the number that a lot of people I've heard have said, that's the number that they gauge it by. I've noticed personally anything under 40, so 39 or below, not including 40, but 39 and below is tolerable, and I'm able to actually, play just fine with very little. You're still getting the mechanics, but they're just not nearly as severe or potent as they would if you go up to a higher number. So that's something that can be an advantage too. And when I say it can be an advantage too, I'm referring strictly to the stacking of the abilities and, how you can be godlike on the meters if you're doing that right. So the ability to have flavor builds is something else that I think is an advantage of it. And there's a paladin that's in my guild that is actually stacking leech corruption and leech on his gear, which I think is very interesting. And he's a tank, so it makes a little bit of sense that you'd want to do something like that. So I'm interested to see how that goes. But as far as flavor builds are concerned, the corruption does open the door up for those types of experimentations as well. So I think that's an advantage, especially if you're doing some PvP and stuff like that. Now, a lot of times in PvP, abilities as far as like Azurite abilities and corruptions and things like that are nerfed a little bit, but it could still have an interesting outcome as well. So I think that'll be something to sort of look forward to in the future, to see what sort of wacky builds people come up with. Now, the next thing that's nice about corruption is that it comes from more than one source. So you don't have to constantly raid over and over and over and over again to get corrupted gear. Although corrupted gear does have a chance to drop in your raids and stuff like that, it also has a chance to drop from, a lot of other sources too, as well as assaults, your caches. You're guaranteed a piece of corrupted gear out of your mythic cache every week. PvP caches, world quests. There's several different sources that you can actually get the corrupted gear. So I find that to be a distinct advantage as well. Now, disadvantages we'll get into here now. Some of the disadvantages that I've encountered so far are I'm not a real big fan of the RNG that's required for you to perform in a way that is expected when you're using the corruptions. And what I mean by that is that Blizzard has stacked a system on top of an already existing system, which was the Titan forging system, right? Now they've removed that and effectively replaced it with corruption as sort of I think it's more of an experiment than anything, it feels like, but it's more RNG than Titan forging was before. And when I say that, I'll explain exactly what I mean. There's several different layers to the way that corruption works as far as the way you want to stack it and the RNG involved. So there's the RNG for your gear, which is inherently built into the game. That is a mechanic that has been part of the game from the beginning. So you will, kill a monster. There's RNG whether or not it has a drop for you and whether or not that drop is something that you can use as far as gear is concerned. Or if you kill a boss, let's say in a dungeon or in a raid or wherever, and it drops gear, will it drop the gear that you require? So that is the first layer of RNG. The second layer of RNG now, whereas it used to be, is it Titan forged or not, yes or no, move forward, in that sort of flowchart, is now replaced with, does it have corruption? So does the gear drop? Does it have corruption? And if it doesn't have corruption, sometimes, especially with like rings and things of that nature, it almost makes them where you wouldn't want them at all. Because generally, like with rings, because of the heavy stat budgets, you almost want corruption on those items. But as far as like bracers and boots and things of that nature too, you get it however you can. So you definitely want to level up your cloak to offset that corruption value and set that budget up for yourself. But that's part of the RNG though, is did the gear drop that you need, and is it the correct corruption, or is there not? Is it the correct corruption, but is there corruption on it at all? Is really the question there. And the next question the next layer of RNG is it the right corruption? So now we have gear, we have a corruption on it. Is it the corruption for you? So does the corruption even matter? Is it something that's going to help you or not? Should you take it to Mother and just cleanse it and just forget that the corruption was ever there? And sometimes the answer to that is yes. It just sort of depends on what you're trying to stack or what's beneficial to your class. So right now we're already at 3 levels of RNG, and the 4th level of RNG comes in, and then there's the fact of whether or not it's the right corruption on the right gear. What you want is like, say, your BIS, boots and bracers and hands and stuff to all have the correct corruption that you need that benefits your class and what you're doing, and it would need to be on those particular, pieces of gear with the correct tier of the corruption on it as well. So there's so much RNG that it's way worse than Titan Forging ever was. But at the same time, there's a lot of potential there. And again, like I mentioned before, we even get into the negative stuff right now that we're getting into. There were distinct advantages as well. So it kind of goes both ways. But it also gives you another thing to sim, which is definitely something I look at as a disadvantage. Is that ends up being like a time sink. Not only do you just sim your normal gear and your character, but you have to take into consideration what corruptions you're running as well. Overall, the balancing seems to be a little bit out of whack across the board for corruptions right now as well. Just something I've kind of noticed. Infinite Star being the number one culprit there. If you've had Infinite Star stacked or seen videos on YouTube or whatever, there are people that are just stacking Infinite Star and they just... Again, back to what I was saying before, they look like gods on the meters, and that's the reason why. It's just so lopsided as far as the DPS increases are concerned. And there's a few that are actually very powerful corruptions. I'm just using Infinite Star because that's the one that everyone sort of looks at when they're thinking that in terms of overall DPS increase. Of course, that's more of a single target sort of increase. From a tier set standpoint, basically, since there are no tier sets anymore, the only thing that you can really do is try to put together all of your BIS gear with the perfect corruptions. You're building your own tier set, essentially. And I don't see why we can't just have tier sets back in that case. Because the gear is doing something, the corruptions make it basically like a passive on you, sort of like a trinket that you don't have to use. Right? Like that's essentially what these are doing. And trinkets already do that, A. And B, old tier sets used to have several of those sort of actions that were built into them. These passive things that would happen, or these benefits that you could get, buffs, temporary buffs and things of this nature that you would get as a benefit from having this set of gear. And that would go up, sometimes high, but generally it was about 4 tiers. Like you'd have gloves, boots, chest, helm. The more that you stacked on, the more of the benefits of the tier set you would get. So essentially what we're doing is we're just sort of building our own custom tier set. And I don't know why we can't just go back to tier sets, because I really love the tier sets. And it always felt really epic when like a new tier set would come out. And just seeing that artwork and stuff like that the art team, which Blizzard I think has an amazing art team, have put together was very satisfying, and it made you look forward to the next tier. And that's something that's just missing right now. I don't know, I don't know if corruptions is a sort of budget fix to sort of patch that or what, but it doesn't feel the same. But I really do miss those tier sets and the baked in passive things that you could get from having those tier sets. And even some of the gear that was almost like if you just paired it up with something like boots or a pair of rings that would do something amazing. You could have a tier set and a pair of rings that would give you 2 different, totally separate interactions as far as like what they're doing to benefit your character. So, I mean, I don't know. Corruptions, it seems like we're grasping at straws to get back to what used to be the tier feel, but it's very weird, the way that they have it set up, and the fact that it has a negative mechanic with it as well is sort of odd, but I understand the reason why they did it. I just wanted to go over some advantages and disadvantages with you guys. Let me know what you think in the comments. This is the first time I've ever done an actual face-to-face video, so maybe I'll keep doing this going forward. I don't know, but yeah, if you like the video, please like and subscribe. Don't forget to click the bell so that you can be notified when new videos are uploaded. And thanks for watching.